To be completely honest, it was very difficult to make these rankings this week. We have a lot of guys moving up and down. I'm going to do my absolute best, which may not be good enough for you, but it's good enough for me. Now, diving into tier one, we are going to be leading off with Kareem Williams, Saquon Barkley, Derrick Henry, and Alvin Kamara. It doesn't matter what league format you're playing in. It doesn't matter who is on your team. These guys are in your lineup, and if they aren't, you're either smoking something or not playing in a real fantasy league. Now, dropping down to tier two, these players should be in your lineup unless you have an absolute god squad somehow. Kenneth Walker here will lead off the very top end of this tier. Going up against the Atlanta Falcons, this is actually a pretty good spot if you're looking at the implied team total. Right now, you have a total over 24 points, and the over-under in this game is over 51. Now, you may say, well, Mason, the Seahawks are dogs. Does this mean that they're not going to run the ball a ton in the second half? Because we have seen Seattle consistently abandon the run in the second half of games if they fall too far behind. Well, my thing is, it doesn't freaking matter when it comes to Kenneth Walker, because if you look at the receiving usage, this man has had 21 targets over the past 3 weeks. Kenneth Walker is sitting here averaging 7 targets a game. It is obnoxious. You have touchdown upside as well, where over the past 3 weeks, the man has 4 touchdowns. Kenneth Walker looks like a legitimate league winner, and this is an example of a running back that if you're playing in a full PPR format, I actually would really like to sell David Montgomery and maybe a depth bench wide receiver to pivot over to Walker, given the receiving usage that you do have. Now, going over to our next name, we will be looking at Breece Hall. Obviously, Breece Hall, super exciting as well. This new coaching staff comes in and they say, okay, Braylon Allen, you're cool, but go to the bench, buddy. Breece Hall is our guy. Breece this past week actually sees a total of 24 opportunities. The receiving usage for Breece has been elite as well. Now, what's interesting is maybe you would say, well, this Jets offense is going to be better now that they have Devonta Adams coming over. But if you're looking at the implied team total right now that you have for the Jets, you're actually only sitting at 19.5 points. This is a tough matchup going up against the Pittsburgh Steelers. Clearly, Breece is a mid RB1. And we've had a bunch of people asking, well, Mason, does Devonta Adams impact the Breece Hall ranking? My thought process is probably not, right? Because if Adams makes this offense better, then they'll have more trips to the red zone, extended drives, which obviously would be good for the running back. But also the drawback of that is we have historically seen Davante Adams in Aaron Rodgers' offenses actually have a massive role at the goal line, and maybe it skews the Jets to be a little bit more pass happy inside the 5-yard line. So I think that there are some positives of Adams coming over. I think that there are some potential negatives. In reality, Breece still mid running back one where you don't have to think about it. Now, our next running back will be Jordan Mason. Now, obviously, we have a bunch of running backs this week that we just don't know the injury updates with quite yet. Now, Jordan Mason did actually get in a limited practice on Wednesday with the shoulder injury. Now, the shoulder injury happened last Thursday, and he was initially labeled as day-to-day. So knowing that you're labeled day-to-day and then you get a 10-day break, I think you can go through and you can start Jordan Mason. I'm playing Sal this week in the Flock League. He has Mason, so I'm really hoping Jordan Mason does nothing. Bijan Robinson will be our next guy. With Bijan, obviously, we've stuck with him as a top 10 running back pretty much all year. He finally comes through for us this past week with 25 fantasy points. I'm not going to be moving him up my rankings, though, because one, we were probably already a little too high on him to begin with. And two, it was a great matchup against the Carolina Panthers. Now here, going up against the Seattle Seahawks, what's very interesting is if you are looking at sportsbooks currently, they are projecting out the Atlanta Falcons to be a top 3 scoring offense here. So while Tyler Algier should have a role, this should be an elite offense according to sportsbooks, which y'all know I stand by. Sportsbooks no more than you do, no more than I do, no more than pretty much everybody does. So they're telling us it's an elite offense. Bijan has a receiving role. Now, of course, I don't want to put him in tier 1 because of the Tyler Algier usage. Jonathan Taylor will be our next back. Now, Jonathan Taylor did not participate in practice on Wednesday, and neither did Trey Sermon. Now, Jonathan Taylor's already missed both weeks 5 and 6 with a high ankle sprain that was labeled as minor for whatever that means. If y'all remember back in week 5, people were saying that this was going to be a 1 to 2 week injury. So with that in mind, I think that there is a shot Taylor is able to come back against the Miami Dolphins. Obviously, this would be a game in which you'd expect that the Colts should be able to run the ball in the second half as they are favored against a Miami team with no Tua. Chuba Hubbard will be our next running back. Now, Chuba Hubbard is a top 10 running back for us every single week without Jonathan Brooks. This week, going up against Washington, it's a great matchup where right now the over-under in this game is over 50 points. Chuba Hubbard's coming off yet again another game with over 20 opportunities with 18 carries and 6 targets. You have the touchdown upside, while at the same time, you have the safe usage as a receiver. So Chuba Hubbard remains one of these low-end RB1s for the time being until Jonathan Brooks does come back in this offense. And once Jonathan Brooks is in, I would expect this to turn into a running back by committee where Chuba Hubbard falls down from being a low-end RB1 to somebody that's barely a borderline flex consideration. So I do want to reiterate, if you are 4-2, what I would recommend is actually to go through and probably pivot over to somebody that has a little more long-term upside. Now, another recommendation I would have is if you're not already on Underdog Fantasy, I would highly recommend going over there and taking advantage of the Bo Nix free square that you're going to get. Higher, lower, half a total yard in this Thursday night game. Now, the initial pick'em I was recommending with this was going to be Spencer Rattler to have fewer than 188.5 passing yards. But honestly, that may be a little bit harder to recommend now that Patrick Surtain's out. I would recommend you possibly go through and leave your favorite pick'em in the comment section for everybody else if we wanted to try to come up with a consensus. But yeah, if you go to the comment section and go through that link and use code FLOCK, you'll get that free Bo Nix pick, more than less than half a total yard. You'll get a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000, and you'll get a free team review in the live stream that we are doing every single day. Just make sure you go through the link in the comment section and use code FLOCK. Now, Jahmyr Gibbs will be our last running back in this tier. With Jahmyr Gibbs, every single week this season, he has had double-digit fantasy points. Now, the usage as a receiver is not as good as what we were hoping for, where, yes, you have 3 games with 5 or more targets, but in weeks 3 and 4, the man had 0 targets out of the backfield. David Montgomery has been dominant in this offense. David Montgomery has more points than Jahmyr Gibbs so far this season. And we can pretty confidently say in games where the Detroit Lions blow out their opponents, it will be a David Montgomery over Jahmyr Gibbs type environment. Now here, going up against the Minnesota Vikings, where the Vikings are favored by about 3 points, I don't know if we can be as excited about David Montgomery. If you go over and look at Underdog Pick'ems, right now they do have Jahmyr Gibbs for more total yards than Montgomery and obviously for more receptions. Now going over to our next tier, we're going to be led off with James Cook. Now whoever the starting running back is in Buffalo will be someone you have to start. Whether that's James Cook, whether that's Ray Davis, we don't know just yet. Now, James Cook did get in a limited practice on Wednesday, but this is a great matchup going up against the Tennessee Titans. The spread on this game is almost 9 points. This is the largest spread that we have seen on any game this week. And here we should be expecting a ton of rush attempts in the second half. Obviously, James Cook has actually gone over double-digit points in every single game this year, minus the Baltimore one. But I don't think the Buffalo Bills are at risk of falling behind in the same way that they did against the Baltimore Ravens. But of course, we will continue to monitor this injury, and I will go ahead and update the rankings on flogfantasy.com the second that we get additional news if we are going to have James Cook labeled as out. Now, Joe Mixon will be our next back here. Funny enough, Joe Mixon only plays 42% of the snaps this past week, but frankly, it does not matter. The man scores 27 fantasy points, was the easiest buy low call that we've had all year 2 weeks back. If you're going to go through and possibly have any bear case against him, this should be a tougher matchup that you have specifically going up against the Green Bay Packers, while at the same time, Joe Mixon doesn't have a massive role as a receiver, where this past week you only have the 3 targets. He's going to get receiving usage, though. He's a 3-down back. It's a good offense. It's really just about the matchup here. And Josh Jacobs will be our next running back. I think Jacobs checks a lot of these boxes as well. The receiving role is going to be similar with Josh Jacobs in comparison to what you have with Joe Mixon. Now, the difference is we have seen Mixon be a more efficient rusher between the tackles so far this year. And also, if you are looking at Josh Jacobs, we haven't had that same type of ceiling, where right now you're looking at 0 total games over 20 fantasy points. I still think that Josh Jacobs is an interesting buy low candidate, where you are looking at a bunch of games where you're closing in or at least hitting 20 total opportunities. And I still personally believe that this is going to be a top 5 to 10 offense in the NFL week in and week out. And you see that with the implied team total this week at 25 points. Now, obviously, David Montgomery is ranked higher than this in our rest of season rankings. Now, specifically, this is going to be a very tough spot to go through and put Montgomery as a running back 1, even if he has been that so far this year against the Minnesota Vikings. If you are all in on David Montgomery and you want to say, Mason, you're a clown, you have no idea what you're doing, which very easily could be true, you can go over to Underdog Fantasy and you can take the higher than 48.5 rushing yards with Montgomery this week. Now, personally, this Minnesota Vikings team does scare me, having the number one defense overall in the NFL, coming out of the bye week as well, and a game environment where typically you see the Detroit Lions with an implied team total of 27, 28 points, projecting out to be one of the best offenses in the league, whereas this week they are 3-point dogs, while at the same time, you actually only have an implied team total of 23.5 points. So the Lions shouldn't be an elite offense this week. According to sportsbooks, the Lions should be a slightly above average offense. According to sportsbooks, there's a real threat that you are actually going to have the Lions trailing in this game. So I think this game, in comparison to previous games this year, is a little bit more of a Jahmyr Gibbs one than a David Montgomery one. And now going over to our next running back, we will have Brian Robinson. If Brian Robinson is 100% healthy, he's way higher than this in my rankings. And again, I'm playing Sal in the Flock League this week. I am really hoping that I am not going to have to go up against full strength Brian Robinson, because here going up against the Carolina Panthers, if Robinson was fully healthy in a game in which the Washington Commanders had the highest implied team total in the entire NFL this week, Brian Robinson very easily could slide into the second tier in these ranks, where every single game that he has had this year, you have hit double-digit fantasy points. You've had some usage as a receiver. Obviously, you've had the touchdown upside as well, where he's played a total of 6 weeks. And in those 6 weeks, you've had 5 rushing touchdowns. And this would be a phenomenal matchup. So I do want to reiterate, Brian Robinson will be much higher in these rankings as the week goes on, if we get confirmation that he is fully healthy. But after missing last week and 2 weeks ago playing only 34% of the snaps, it's difficult for me to rank him as a top 10 running back until we see more practice reports. Now, our next running back, also a very easy buy low candidate for us last week, was J.K. Dobbins. Dobbins coming off the 25 rush attempts, the rushing touchdown. I mean, you actually saw in weeks 3 and week 4 that Dobbins was slowly but surely increasing the percentage of snaps that he was accounting for in this offense. And this past week, that got up to 73% against the Denver Broncos. Now, this is a phenomenal matchup going up against the Arizona Cardinals, where actually you have an implied team total here for the Los Angeles Chargers at about 23.5 points, which is about the same mark as what you have with the Detroit Lions. Typically, what we have seen so far this year for the Chargers is they are actually sitting with an implied team total of around 17, 18, 19 points in most of these games. So the Chargers should be a better offense than what we are typically used to expecting. Dobbins has, a crazy workload with no Gus Edwards in. And also, we have seen some top-end efficiency from Dobbins in the first 2 weeks of the career in good matchups, where this should be one of those in week 7. Tony Pollard will be our next back. It feels weird having Tony Pollard this low because you have no Tyjae Spears. So Pollard does project out to very easily see 20 opportunities in this game. Obviously, that's not super new for Tony Pollard, where he's been there consistently really all year outside of what you had back in week 3. Now, with that being said, my drawback is you actually have the Tennessee Titans this week against the Buffalo Bills, projecting out to be the worst offense in the NFL, according to Las Vegas sportsbooks. So with Pollard, you have a very safe role as a receiver, while at the same time, we can project you out to have 20 plus opportunities. The issue is maybe the touchdown upside is going to be a little bit capped, and a bad matchup and a game where they have to abandon the run in the second half. Now, going over to our next guy, we will be looking at James Conner. I have James Conner in the Flock League. I need a big week this week. Please come through for us, buddy. The reality is he's coming off a game where he only played 28% of snaps. Obviously, the Arizona Cardinals got boat raced against the Green Bay Packers, so I don't want to sit here and act like that is a guarantee by any means here going up against the Chargers. But you do probably have no Marvin Harrison Jr. This is a game in which you actually have the Arizona Cardinals as dogs, and it's not a great matchup going up against the Chargers. So not super excited. It is nice to see that he had 5 targets last week, but that hasn't been the norm. Now, if you told me Mason Chase Brown's going to see again 60+% of the snaps here in Cincinnati, Chase Brown would be a lot higher in these rankings. Obviously, what we saw last week is we saw this Cincinnati Bengals team deciding to punish, bench, whatever you want to call it, Zach Moss after Zach Moss lost the fumble and Chase Brown did take over as the man. Now, with that being said, I do think that there is an outside chance, just an outside chance, that we actually get a little bit more involvement this week for Zach Moss in comparison to what we had previously, or at least in week 6. So I would like to see just another week here specifically for Chase Brown with this role. And then in that case, he will be sliding up these rankings dramatically. I mean, right now the Bengals are heavy favorites over the Cleveland Browns. Now, Devon Achane will be down here at 21. Obviously, Achane 3 games with no Tua. He has not hit a single game with double-digit fantasy points. If you were one of the people telling me I lost my mind for saying him sell high, I think you should probably apologize, but that's just me. In reality, he still does have the receiving role. He was at practice on Wednesday. I think he should be good to go. But the issue is bad offense. Mostert's back, which was the expectation, obviously. So, I mean, in my mind, not a ton changes here with Achane. But I will say once Tua comes back in and this offense projects out to be one of the better offenses in the NFL yet again, Achane will move back to being an RB1. So if you look at my rest of season rankings on the site, there we actually do have Achane as a top 12 option. Kareem Hunt will be our next player. Kareem Hunt, another option similar to Chase Brown, where if you told me, hey, Mason, you can lock it in, Kareem Hunt is going to have 20 plus opportunities yet again in this Chiefs offense. Kareem Hunt would be way, way too low in these rankings, and we would move him dramatically up. Now, of course, we just simply don't know if that is the case. We don't know exactly what the workload should be here. And of course, I'm not coming out saying, oh, we have to worry about Clyde Edwards-Helaire turning into the starting running back. I don't think Clyde Edwards-Helaire is a good running back. I don't think anybody here is assuming that. But what I would potentially be a little bit concerned about is what happens if Clyde Edwards-Helaire comes in and he may not necessarily see the starting job, but what happens if he sees 40% of the opportunities? And in that case, I do think you have to be a little bit worried about the Kareem Hunt's floor and the Kareem Hunt role actually just taking a little bit of a dip. So I'm not trying to sit here and overreact and say that, oh, this guy's going to fall with Hunt. No, he could be a lot higher in these rankings. But I do think that we could just wait another week so we get the confirmation of what the role looks like. Now, dropping down to our next tier, Javante Williams consistently seeing over 60% of the snaps here for the Broncos. I may end up starting Javante Williams this week, to be honest with you. I don't love it, but we may end up having to do it. The reason is the only week I think I started Javante in the Flock League was against the Raiders, where you had the Denver Broncos actually favored. If the Broncos are favored, we can expect them to run the ball a little bit more. Javante Williams has appeared to be their guy. And at the same time, Javante's been getting some pretty consistent usage as a receiver. Over the past 5 weeks, you've had 5, 4, 3, 6, and 6 targets. This matchup against the Saints isn't a great one, but they could potentially run the ball in the second half. I will reiterate, of course, I know Javante is probably not a top 2 running back for you, but if you do decide that he's flex worthy for you this week, since he's playing on Thursday night, please make sure you put him in at RB2 and move whoever your RB2 is down to the flex, just in case anything happens later in the week and you need the additional flexibility. Now, Naji Harris will be our next back. Naji Harris, we got a lot of hate on having him quote unquote too high against the Raiders in these rankings last week. What do you want from me? It's a great matchup against the Raiders. We are going to be very high in running backs against the Raiders. Look at Kyren Williams being number 1 this week. But yeah, obviously we're going to have Najee lower in week 7 than we did in week 6, knowing that Jaylen Warren's back. This is probably back to being a committee. Here you had Najee Harris dipping down to under 50% of the team snaps. And it's a much tougher matchup going up against the Jets. So not super excited about it. I will say you could potentially expect a few more checkdowns with Russell Wilson under center. Zach Moss will be our next name. With Zach Moss, this past week was the first week that we had with fewer than 50% of the snaps in Cincinnati. Obviously, it looks like Moss could be getting benched here for Chase Brown. I would prefer Brown at this point, but there is that outside chance that they decide to pivot back over. TBsby will be our next running back, and I'll be honest with you, I don't know how to rank him right now. We don't know the update with Travis Etienne. We don't know the update with Bigsby himself. Dearness Johnson may be mixed in. Bigsby's probably not going to have a receiving role where this man has had a total of 1 target all season. So I would not want to bank on TBsby until we get a little more information. Obviously, we'll be updating these rankings later in the week, and we'll be updating on the site as soon as news comes out. Ramondre Stevenson was not at practice on Wednesday. I'm not super excited about Ramondre anyway. Against the Miami Dolphins, he only played 47% of the snaps, and he had the exact amount of snaps played for Antonio Gibson. So not super pumped with Ramondre in general, and we don't even know if he's going to be healthy. Ty Chandler, I don't know the availability of Aaron Jones. I don't know the availability of Cam Akers yet either. It's a tough matchup going up against the Detroit Lions. Chandler's been the least efficient running back in the entire NFL so far this year. Obviously, it's a good offense, and there's a chance that he is the starter, so I want to give him his credit, but impossible to rank him. Devin Singletary's impossible to rank. No idea if he's going to be good to go. No idea what their usage is going to be with Tyrone Tracy. We'll update it later in the week. Nick Chubb is tough to rank. I would rather not plan on starting Nick Chubb in week 7 if you can avoid it. I definitely think that Nick Chubb has some upside rest of season, but keep in mind, this is one of the worst offenses in the NFL. Nick Chubb's not historically a receiver, and the efficiency is probably going to dip based off him coming off the significant injury. Alexander Madison's impossible to rank before we know the Zamir White updates. The matchup against the Rams isn't great where you are 7-point dogs. Bucky Irving is impossible to rank. If Rachaad White does play, then at that point it looks to be a 3-man running back by committee between Bucky Irving, Sean Tucker, and Rachaad White. And you're in a game where you're most likely to be trailing in the second half and need to throw the ball. Tyler Algier, good matchup, but obviously Bijan is the dude. Zach Charbonnet, good game environment, but obviously Kenneth Walker's the dude. Austin Eckler, good matchup, but obviously Brian Robinson's the dude. And then Rachaad White, like we said, impossible to rank. So obviously the guys at the very bottom end, very difficult to rank. These rankings are going to look much different a few days from now. I'll update them on the site literally every single day. I'll update them on the YouTube channel later in the week. So of course you can always go over to flockfantasy.com and check out all our rankings, link your team for free, and actually see updated power rankings with your league. Whole bunch of stuff. And you can subscribe to the channel if you want to see the flex rankings later in the week. But of course, I do want to reiterate, if you wanted a free team review in the live streams that we're doing every single day, I'd highly recommend taking advantage of the promo that we have on Underdog Fantasy, where if you go to the link in the description or the comment section and use promo code FLOCK on Underdog, you'll be getting a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000. You'll be getting a free Bo Nix pick, more than less than half a total yard in the game on Thursday, and a free team review as well in the live streams that we're doing every single night. Just make sure that you set up an account on flockfantasy.com with the same email address as your account on Underdog Fantasy. That way I know who should be getting that free team review to. But thank you again. I really do appreciate you and really hope I get to see you out with the live stream later tonight.